The world's most vital economic artery just suffered a massive heart attack, and, well, the shockwaves are hitting your wallet right now.
Yeah, we are looking at a complete systemic shutdown of the global supply chain. And the really terrifying part is that it happened in, just a matter of hours.
Right. So to figure out how we actually got here, we're pulling from a massive stack of sources for today's deep dive. We've got declassified intelligence reports, global economic forecasts, geopolitical op-eds, you name it.
But before we get into the deep mechanics of this crisis, we really need to get you, the listener, caught up on the raw facts.
Exactly. So here is your 90-second breakdown. February 28th, 2026. The U.S. and Israel launch Operation Epic Fury.
Which was this unprecedented, highly coordinated strike that killed Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, along with dozens of senior officials.
Right. And Iran strikes back instantly. I mean, they launch massive missile and drone barrages on U.S. bases across the Gulf. We're talking targets in Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, plus strikes on Israel.
But the real gut punch to the globe, they shut down the Strait of Hormuz.
And just like that, 20% of the world's daily oil supply just vanished from the market, completely erased.
The market reaction was, well, it was violent. Brent crude prices exploded to $126 a barrel.
Wow.
Yeah, and Dubai crude hit an all-time record of $166.
And then commercial traffic through that 21-mile-wide strait just plunged by 70% in a matter of hours, stranding over 150 massive ships right outside the waterway.
Until eventually, traffic dropped to absolute zero, just total paralysis.
So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack exactly how this narrow stretch of water brought the entire global economy to its knees.
Yeah, we're going to look at why the main combatants are locked in this deadly standoff.
And how some very unlikely middle powers are scrambling to prevent World War III.
Because to understand the sheer panic gripping the world right now, we really have to look beyond just those raw numbers.
Right.
We know what happened, but the why is hidden in the actual physical and digital anatomy of this blockade.
Let's actually explore that anatomy, because, when you hear the word blockade, it's really easy to just picture a literal wall of Iranian warships parked bow to stern across the water.
Yeah, like an old movie or something.
Exactly. But in the 21st century, a blockade is, it's a lot more sophisticated than that. So how are they actually keeping these massive supertankers out?
Well, they're using a multi-layered denial strategy. So first, you have the physical kinetic attacks, drones and missiles just actively hitting tankers.
Right, like we saw the Senegal maybe get hit by a sea drone, over 500 miles away near Kuwait?
Yeah, over 500 miles. And we saw Indian sailors killed on the skylight. But honestly, the really terrifying part for ship captains is what they cannot see.
You mean the naval mines?
Exactly. U.S. intelligence confirmed that Iran laid advanced naval mines all throughout the strait.
Jeez, so a mine could just be anywhere, drifting right beneath the surface.
Yeah, but to make matters even worse, Iran isn't just threatening the physical ships. They are attacking the ship's digital nervous systems, too.
Wait, how so?
They are aggressively spoofing satellite signals and jamming GPS.
Okay, let's break that down for a second. Because jamming and spoofing, they sound similar, but they're very different threats, right? I mean, jamming is basically just screaming static at a receiver so it goes blind.
Spot on. Yeah, jamming means your navigation screens just go blank. You know you're lost.
Right.
But spoofing is far more insidious. Spoofing is when a hostile actor actively lies to your navigation system.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they broadcast a fake GPS signal that is slightly stronger than the real satellite signal.
So you're driving this massive, highly explosive oil tanker through a narrow 21-mile channel.
Right.
You look at your screen, and it tells you that you are perfectly centered in the safe shipping lane.
But in reality, the spoof signal has quietly steered you 2 miles off course, straight into a freshly laid minefield.
That is absolutely terrifying.
It is. And because the risk of hitting an invisible mine or, being digitally hijacked is so incredibly high, the maritime insurance market just completely collapsed.
Like overnight.
Pretty much.
Mm.
War risk insurance premiums jumped by 4 to 6 times in a matter of days.
Wow.
And eventually the syndicates in London just pulled their coverage entirely. They just walked away.
But wait, if a supertanker and its cargo are worth hundreds of millions of dollars and the whole global economy depends on it, why wouldn't state governments just step in to underwrite the insurance themselves? Just to keep the ships moving.
You'd think so, but the risk calculus simply breaks down.
Even for a government.
Yeah, even for a major government. Underwriting the loss of a massive oil tanker, plus the billions of dollars in environmental cleanup if it sinks and spills millions of barrels of crude, I mean, that is an astronomical financial liability.
Right, of course.
So without basic commercial insurance, ship owners simply refuse to risk the journey. The ships drop anchor and they just stop moving.
And when the ships stop moving, the economic bleeding begins. Let's talk about the cascading mechanisms here, because this isn't just some headache for oil executives.
No, not at all.
Like, if you bought groceries this morning, you've already paid the Hormuz tax without even realizing it.
You absolutely have. See, when the strait closed, the oil pumped in the Middle East suddenly had nowhere to go. Storage facilities filled up to the brim in a matter of days.
Right, because they can't ship it out.
Exactly. So Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, they were forced into a corner. They had to declare force majeure, and they slashed their oil production by a combined 10 million barrels a day.
Okay, let's clarify force majeure for a second, because it translates to superior force, and people often hear it called an act of God clause. But it's actually a massive legal tripwire, isn't it?
Oh, it is the ultimate domino in global trade.
How so?
Well, force majeure is a legal mechanism that allows a country or a company to break its binding supply contracts without getting sued into oblivion.
Because an unforeseeable crisis basically made fulfilling the contract impossible.
Right. But when Saudi Arabia declares it, the refiner in Japan doesn't get their crude.
Oh, I see.
So then the Japanese refiner declares it to the plastics manufacturer in Germany, and so on. It triggers this cascade of broken contracts across the entire planet.
And that takes us right to the pricing mechanisms. The sources highlighted Dubai crude hitting $166 a barrel. Why does that specific benchmark matter so much?
Because Dubai crude is the primary reference price for oil heading into Asia.
Okay.
When that benchmark spikes, the entire manufacturing hub of the world, places like China, India, South Korea, they suddenly pay drastically more for energy.
Right, they're not just going to eat that cost.
Exactly. To survive, those factories pass that massive energy cost directly onto the consumer goods they produce.
So every plastic toy, every electronic device, every piece of clothing just becomes way more expensive to make and ship.
Exactly.
But the hidden shockwave here, and honestly maybe the scariest part of this entire deep dive, is that this energy crisis is actually a food crisis in disguise.
Yes, that is the huge blind spot for most people.
Break that down for us.
Well, a huge amount of liquefied natural gas, or LNG, comes out of Qatar through that exact same strait.
Right.
And within a week of the blockade, natural gas prices in Europe doubled.
It's insane.
And the Persian Gulf produces nearly half of the world's urea and 30% of its ammonia.
Which are the essential chemical building blocks for nitrogen fertilizer.
Exactly. And synthesizing that fertilizer requires a massive amount of natural gas.
So the equation is brutal. I mean, no natural gas means no fertilizer.
Right. Up to 30% of the world's internationally traded fertilizer normally passes through the Strait of Hormuz.
Wow.
So because of the blockade, global urea prices shot up by 50% in just a few short weeks.
And timing is everything here, right?
Right.
Because this crisis detonated right around the critical spring planting season.
Exactly. If farmers cannot afford fertilizer, corn yields just plummet.
And if corn yields plummet, the feedstock for U.S. beef, poultry, dairy, all of it becomes incredibly scarce and expensive.
Right. Financial analysts are projecting that this specific shock will drive up your grocery bills and inflate global food prices all the way through 2027.
And that's running parallel to what you're already paying at the pump. I mean, in California, gas prices easily topped $5 a gallon in the second week of March.
Yeah, it's hitting everywhere. But here is where the situation shifts from a simple blockade to, honestly, a geopolitical shakedown.
What do you mean?
Well, Iran didn't just close the strait and walk away. They created a toll booth.
Right, they carved out their own shipping lane north of Lorak Island.
Yeah, and if you want to use it, you have to pay a toll.
And reports show they're charging ships up to $2 million for a single safe passage.
$2 million.
And crucially, they are demanding those fees be paid in Chinese yuan, not U.S. dollars.
Man, imagine if someone barricaded the only highway out of your town, but then offered to personally guide you through the dangerous back roads if you just, hand over your life savings.
That is exactly what Iran is doing to the global economy right now. Which brings us to the multi-trillion-dollar question. How long can the global supply chain actually survive a shock like this before things start breaking permanently?
And unfortunately, the answer depends entirely on the political standoff.
Right, because if the economic pain is this brutal, and it's hurting everyone from farmers in the American Midwest to factory owners in Asia, basic logic dictates that Washington and Tehran should be sprinting to the negotiating table.
You would think so, yeah.
But logic kind of completely goes out the window when you look at what these two combatants are actually demanding from each other.
Yeah, they've both dug into these extreme, just unyielding positions.
Now, before we dive into these specific demands, just a quick note for the listener. We are pulling this information directly from declassified intelligence memos and formal political statements provided in our sources.
Right. We're analyzing these geopolitical maneuvers objectively just to understand why the standoff is happening.
Exactly. We are absolutely not endorsing the military rhetoric, the political stances, or the actions of either Washington or Tehran. Our goal is simply to map the reality of the crisis.
Yeah.
So with that framework in place, what is the U.S. actually demanding?
Well, the U.S. position is anchored in maximum pressure.
Okay.
President Trump has publicly threatened to obliterate Iran's power grid and strike their energy infrastructure if the strait isn't opened immediately.
And behind the scenes?
Behind the scenes, the U.S. transmitted a 15-point ceasefire plan through intermediaries.
What are the actual mechanics of that plan? Like, what are they asking for?
It demands that Iran completely dismantle its deeply buried nuclear facilities at Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordo.
Wow. Completely dismantle them.
Yes, and it requires them to surrender their entire enriched uranium stockpile to international inspectors.
That's a huge ask.
It gets bigger. It also demands that Iran stop funding its regional proxy networks like Hezbollah and the Houthis and immediately reopen the Strait of Hormuz.
And what does Iran get in exchange for all of this?
In exchange, the U.S. would lift nuclear-related sanctions.
Okay, wait. Let me make sure I'm hearing
A
this
single
correctly.
vote in the U.S. Senate
is
can
essentially
freeze the most
asking a
powerful
sovereign
government on
nation
Earth
to
but right now,
voluntarily
a
dismantle
political
its entire
standoff
state
threatens
security
to blow up the
apparatus
rules forever.
and abandon
Yeah, we are watching
decades
the
of strategic
fundamental
investments
machinery of American
just for
lawmaking
sanctions
just
relief.
That's the offer on the
grind
table.
to an
So
absolute
what
halt.
is
And
Iran's
honestly, the
counteroffer?
physical toll on the
Well,
people inside
to
that
understand
building
Iran's
is about to
response,
become very
we
real.
really have to look
Right, so
past
let's set the
standard
scene.
military
It's
doctrine
March
and
2026.
understand Shia political
Picture the
theology.
hallways of the United States
Theology.
Capitol right now.
How does that play into a
Aides are
naval
literally
blockade?
dragging military
Because
style
they don't
cots
view the
into back
assassination of
offices.
Supreme Leader
Oh,
Ali
yeah.
Khamenei as
Staffers
just
are
losing a
stockpiling
top-tier
energy drinks by
general
the
or a
case.
politician.
Exactly. We're looking at
How
a
do they
scenario
view it,
where
though?
senators
In
might
their
actively
system, the Supreme
refuse to
Leader
drink
is
water
the Vali Faqih.
just so they don't have to
that
leave the
translates
floor to
to
use
the
the
guardianship
restroom.
Which
of
is
the Islamic
wild, and
jurist.
it's all
Okay.
because the
He
Senate
is considered the
completely
embodiment of
deadlocked
divine
over
governance
the
on
Save
Earth
America
until the
Act.
return
Right, a
of
big
their
election
Hindu
overhaul
Oh,
bill.
I see.
Yeah.
It's
So a
centered
kinetic
around
strike
measures
on
like
the
voter
Supreme
ID
Leader isn't just a
requirements.
military loss.
Democrats are
Exactly.
aggressively
It's a
blocking this
profound
legislation,
civilizational and
and
theological
Republicans desperately
trauma.
want to pass it.
Basically a
But
strike
they
on the
lack
divine
the 60
order
votes
itself.
required to break
Precisely.
the stalemate.
And
Which
because
means
of that
frustrations
theological
are just
framing,
boiling
a
over.
standard proportional
Today,
military
you have 28
response
Republican
is just
senators,
impossible
people like
for them.
Pete
Right, they can't
Ricketts
just
and
sink a
Cynthia
U.S. ship and
Lummis
call it even.
demanding
Exactly.
that the
The
Senate
response
force
must
a
be
grueling,
institutional
physical,
and
talking
maximalist.
filibuster.
They
So
want to
the
force
Iranian
Democrats
parliament
to stand on the
swiftly
floor
pass
and
new
talk
laws
until
to
their
formally
vocal
take
cords just
legal
give
control
out. And
of
if
the
that
Strait of
fails,
Hormuz.
they want to break the
And what are
standing
their
rules of the
demands?
Senate
Their
entirely
counter-demands
to
are
force a final
staggering.
vote.
And
They
the real
want an
shocker dropped
absolute
just a few
end
days
to
ago.
all U.S.
Senator
and
John
Israeli
Cornyn,
military
a man
aggression.
who fiercely
Okay, that's
defended the
They
old
are
Senate
demanding
rules
the
for his
payment
entire
of
career,
massive war reparations.
just
Great
published
reparations.
this
Wow.
fiery
And
op-ed.
this is
Right,
the critical
saying Republicans
sticking
must
point.
act
They
now
want
to
the
get this
international
bill
community
passed.
to
Yeah, he
formally
said they had to deal a
recognize
fatal
Iranian
blow to the
sovereignty
rules,
over the
which
Strait of
instantly triggered a
Hormuz.
massive
Okay,
public
let's just
call out
step
from
back
former
and look at
Senator
the
Joe
sheer
Manchin.
scale of these demands.
Manchin
It's a
slammed
lot.
Cornyn
Yeah.
online
I mean,
for,
the U.S.
well,
wants
a
Iran to
massive
give up its
flip-flop.
nuclear
Because the
program
rules of the
and its
Senate
proxy
are
network
quite
just for
literally
sanctions
hanging by a
relief.
thread right
Right.
now. I mean,
And
the
Iran
decisions
wants
made in the
US
next
to
few
pay
days will
war
dictate how
reparations
American
and
laws are
legally
written for
hand
the
over
next
a choke
century.
point that handles
Welcome
a
to
fifth
this
of the
deep
world's
dive.
daily oil
Today,
supply.
we
Yeah,
have
it's
a custom
wild.
mission
Aren't they
tailored
basically
just for
just
you.
playing a massive
We're going to explore
high-stakes
the
game of
swashbuckling,
chicken while the rest of the
pirate-filled
world pays
origins
for the
of the
crash?
filibuster.
That
It
is
is a
the
crazy
textbook
history. It
really
definition
is.
of an unresolvable
We'll also break down the
conflict.
terrifying
Both
parliamentary
sides have
weapon
drawn
known as the
deeply
nuclear
entrenched
option.
red lines
And finally,
that the
we will
other side
unpack a
simply cannot
mind-bending
cross
mathematical
without looking like
concept
they're
called
surrendering
the
on the world
Manchin
stage.
paradox.
So neither
Right,
side
Which
has an
proves
offer.
exactly why
Exactly,
politicians use
neither side.
gridlock
So if
as a
Washington
highly
and Tehran are
calculated
totally deadlocked and all
mathematical
the old
strategy.
diplomatic playbooks
So,
are just burning up,
by the end of this conversation,
who actually steps
you will
up
hold the
to
secret
fix
decoder
a broken
ring
global
for the
economy?
chaos you
Well,
see on
someone
the news.
has to intervene
You will
before
understand
the supply
the
chain
hidden game
shatters
theory
completely.
that
Right.
And that brings
drives
us to
these
the most
high-stakes
fascinating
showdowns.
geopolitical
Absolutely.
shift in this
Okay, let's
entire
unpack
unpack
crisis.
this. Yeah, because
before we can
traditional
truly
superpower
grasp
diplomacy,
the physical threats and the
completely
massive
collapsed here.
stakes
It did. So
of
the
this
task of saving the
2026
global
FZV
economy has
America Act
basically fallen
standoff.
to this unexpected
We
cast
really
of
need to
middle
look at what the
powers
filibuster
who are
actually
frantically
is.
scrambling
And more importantly,
for a
how
clean
it's
start.
being.
And the loudest voice
Because
in that
it wasn't
room right
designed
now,
this
which
way
might
by the
surprise a
founders,
lot of
right?
people,
Right.
Like this
is
wasn't in the
Pakistan.
blueprint.
Yeah.
Not at all. If you
Pakistan.
read the U.S.
Why Pakistan?
Constitution,
I mean,
you
they
will
aren't
not
exactly
find the
the
word
first country
filibuster
people think
anywhere in
of
the
for
text.
global
Wow,
maritime
nowhere.
crisis
Nowhere.
management.
True.
The
But
Constitution
Pakistan
basically
is
gives the
positioned
Senate the
perfectly
authority
for
to set its
this
own internal
specific,
rules.
highly
So
volatile
back in
crisis
1789,
because during the
they
very
possess
first
a
session,
really
debates
unique
ended with just a
structural
simple
advantage.
majority vote.
Like what?
Okay, so
Geographically,
51
they
votes
share a
and you're done.
565-mile
But there was
border
this
with
massive
Iran.
loophole.
So they're right next
They
door.
never
Exactly.
codified a
And
specific procedure
demographically,
to
they are
force a
home
vote
to
happen
roughly
if
40
someone
million
simply
Shia
refused to
citizens.
stop talking.
Wow,
Ah.
40 million.
So without a mechanism to cut off
massive.
debate,
It is, and that massive
politicians figured out
demographic
they could
gives
just, you know,
Islamabad
hold
a
the floor
deep
hostage.
cultural
They
and
did.
religious
We actually
credibility
have
when
diaries from the
speaking
very
to the
first
leadership
session
in
of the
Tehran.
Senate.
but they also
Pennsylvania
have
Senator
deep
William
historical
McClay wrote
military
down in
ties to
sheer
the United
frustration
States,
that
right?
senators
Yes,
from
they do.
Virginia
And
were
here is the
intentionally
absolute
talking away the
linchpin.
clock.
Just to make sure a
Pakistan's military
specific bill
chief,
couldn't
Field
pass.
Marshal Asim
Right.
Munir,
They literally
has a direct
weaponized the
personal
clock.
line to
I mean, if they were
President
holding
Trump.
the legislative
really?
process
Yeah,
hostage,
they built
it
a
makes perfect
strong
sense why the
functional
press
rapport
eventually
during a
started calling
previous
them
crisis
pirates.
back in 2025.
Which brings us to the actual
So you have a
word
Pakistani
filibuster.
military leader
Yeah,
who
it's
can
easily
literally
one of
pick
the
up the
strangest
phone,
words in
talk
American
directly to the
politics.
Oval
So where does
Office,
it come from?
and then turn around
The
and
etymology
speak with
is
cultural
fascinating,
authority
honestly.
to
The
the
term
hardliners
really
in
took
Tehran.
hold in the 1850s.
Exactly. They are the
It comes
ultimate
from the
back
Dutch
channel
word
right now.
"vreboiter"
But Pakistan isn't
and the
just playing the
Spanish
Good
word
Samaritan here,
filibustero.
right?
Which
I
translates
mean, they aren't
directly to
passing
freebooter or
messages
pirate, right?
out of the
Yes.
goodness of their hearts.
Specifically,
The
the
stakes for them
mercenaries
have got to
and
be
pirates
incredibly
who raided
dangerous.
Caribbean
existential.
islands and
How
Latin
so?
American
Well,
countries
Pakistan has a
during
mutual
that era.
defense pact
So they were
with
calling
Saudi
these
Arabia.
distinguished
Okay.
senators
It is
pirates.
described in the
Pretty
intelligence
much.
reports as
The term
an
entered the
Article
political
5
lexicon
style
because
agreement,
observers
very
recognize
similar
the
to the
behavior.
core tenet of NATO.
Senators who talk
an
for
attack on one
hours
is considered
were
an
literally
attack on both.
hijacking the
Right,
Senate
I've
floor.
heard of that.
Like
And
taking a government
crucially,
hostage,
this
just like a
pact
pirate
involves
taking over a ship.
Pakistan
Exactly.
extending its
So
nuclear
let's track
umbrella
how the Senate
over
tried
Saudi
to fight off
Arabia.
these legislative
Wait, so
pirates.
if Saudi Arabia
Because as
decides
the
they
country
have
grew,
absorbed enough
I mean,
of
you couldn't
Iran's
just have
missile
one
strikes
person shut down
and
the
they
entire
fully
government
enter a
for
hot
weeks on
war.
end.
No,
Pakistan's
you couldn't.
treaty
But it took a
obligations
long time to
instantly
build a
drag
defense.
them
By
into
the
a
early
regional
20th
conflict.
century, these
Man.
marathon
So
speeches
Pakistan
became
is highly
catastrophic
motivated
for a
to
modernizing
de-escalate
nation.
this
I can
standoff.
imagine.
So
Because
finally,
if
in
they fail,
1917,
they are instantly
President
on the
Woodrow
front lines
Wilson
of a
pushed the
devastating
Senate
war.
to adopt Rule 22.
Pakistan is essentially like the
This
mutual
rule
friend
created
caught
a
in the middle
formal
of a
process
deeply
called
bitter
cloture.
divorce.
That's a great
Closure,
way to
okay.
put it,
They
which
know
is
both
simply a
sides,
mechanism to
they're
force an
nervously
end to
passing
debate.
notes between them,
But here's
but they
the
are
catch.
terrified
It
that the second
required
someone throws a
massive
punch,
two-thirds
they're going to be
majority
the one who
vote to
gets hit.
trigger.
Two-thirds,
That is the
wow,
perfect
which is an
analogy.
incredibly steep hill
And
to
they
climb.
realized they
So
cannot
stiff
manage this
that over the
alone.
next
So
4
who did they
decades,
bring in?
the Senate only
Pakistan
managed
teamed
to
up with
successfully
China
invoke
to issue
cloture
a formal
5 times.
5-point peace
That
plan.
is wild.
China
Yeah.
obviously has
Southern senators
massive
famously
skin in the game
used
here,
this
too.
exact
Oh,
tool to
huge.
block
China
civil
is the
rights
world's
legislation
top
for years.
buyer of
The
Iranian
gridlock
oil.
grew so intense
Really?
that
Yeah,
in
roughly
1975,
40%
of
of China's
China's
lowered
crude
that
imports
threshold
come
from
right through
two-thirds
that
down to
very
60
strait
Wow.
out of the 100
So this joint
total senators.
China-Pakistan
peace plan
okay.
calls
And
for
that
an
60
immediate
vote threshold
ceasefire
is the number that
and,
dominates our
crucially, the
politics
restoration
today.
of normal
Exactly.
passage in
But
the Strait
here's
of
where I
Hormuz.
think a lot of
You know,
people
the
get
phrasing
confused.
there is really
When we
interesting.
hear the word
they use the term
filibuster,
normal passage.
we don't
Right.
just think
They
of
aren't
a 60
explicitly
vote
commanding
math problem.
Iran to
We
surrender
picture
the strait.
Jimmy Stewart in
which
Mr.
obviously
Smith
saves
Goes to
face for
Washington.
Tehran.
Right, the classic movie
But they are
scene.
clearly
we picture a single person
rejecting
standing at a
Iran's
podium, reading the
new
phone book,
multi-million
sweating,
dollar
refusing
toll
to
booth
sit
system.
down.
Exactly.
But
It is
senators
a
rarely
very
do that
careful,
anymore. Why don't they
highly
have to physically
calibrated
talk
diplomatic
today?
dance.
That
Yeah.
is a
But what is
crucial piece
truly
of the puzzle.
fascinating, and
So
honestly,
in the
what might be
1970s,
the
the
lasting
Senate
legacy
created
of this
something
entire
called the
crisis is
two-track
how
system.
Indo-Pacific
Two-track system.
powers
How did that
are
work?
adapting on Well, the fly. before the
What do you
system,
mean
a
by
filibuster stopped all
Well,
Senate
because
business
while
completely.
these grand peace
Nothing anything else
plans are
could
being
happen.
drafted and
The Senate
debated,
realized they had
countries
a whole
like
country
India
to run,
and
so they
China are
changed the
not just
procedure.
waiting
Makes
around.
sense.
Right.
They
Under
are
the new
quietly
system, if a
cutting
senator
their own
simply threatened to
bilateral
filibuster
side
a
deals
bill,
with
the
Iran,
Senate leadership
just
would
to
just
get
set
their
that
ships through.
controversial
Yeah,
bill
the sources
aside on a
detailed some
different
pretty
track and move
incredible
on to
maneuvers
other
there. Like,
business.
Oh,
China
wow.
managed
So
to
they
get
made it
several of
painless.
its massive
You didn't have to
bulk
stand up and
carriers
destroy your
through the
vocal
strait
cords anymore. You just sent
simply
an
by
email
broadcasting that the
saying,
ships were
"I object," and
Chinese
the bill
owned.
was frozen.
Basically leveraging
Like
their
a silent
status as
filibuster.
Iran's
You capture the
biggest
dynamic
customer.
Exactly.
perfectly.
And then India
The
took a much
physical
more
endurance
muscular
requirement
approach, right?
basically
They
vanished.
did. India actually
But the
sent
physical
their
records
own
from
Navy
before and
destroyers
outside
to
that silent
physically
system,
escort Indian
those
flagged gas
remain pretty
carriers
legendary.
through the
Oh,
Gulf of
absolutely.
Oman.
Under a
Strom
mission
Thurmond
called
spoke against
Operation
the Civil
Sankalp,
Rights
right?
Act
Yes,
in 1957.
And even
for
nations like
24
Malaysia
hours
and
and
Turkey
18
Imagine
minutes.
finding out
successfully
you're
negotiated
hours.
direct
Is
and the
secret
modern
lateral
individual
government
governments
belongs
massive
to probably
Iran
drug addiction.
to let their
It
commercial
does.
ships
Pretty
pass
in
on
April
the
2025,
Yeah, they just went straight to
Booker
Tehran.
spoke
Right.
for an
See,
astonishing
imagine just for a
25
second
hours
that
and
the
5
U.S.
minutes
represents a
against the
fundamental
policies of the
fraction
Donald
how the
Trump
world
administration.
How
I mean, just
so?
think
your
about the
family
bodily
and the
reality
reality
of
of
25
25
hours.
hours. This money was
Essentially,
strictly
Nazi
for
down,
fixing a
you
leaking
cannot
roof.
leave
lean
The
on
United
your
States
dad
You
said
can't
has
even leave
acted
the
if we
chamber
don't
for a
fix this
bathroom
room,
break.
It is a brutal, dangerous
existential
test.
crisis for the
Major
House.
economies are
Exactly.
now
Save the
making
House
private
fund.
really
Side
reminds me of a
bills. Your
passenger
car
on a
breaks
very
down.
nation
Holding
who
a
decides
flight
to just
hostage, you've got bills
yank
piling
the
up.
emergency
They
brake,
are
throwing
essentially
everyone
saying
else
refund.
into the walls
We
just
no
because
longer
they
Take that
trust
money,
the
pay off your
wire
credit cards,
destination
and tell your
umbrella.
family,
It is a
"Hey, don't
highly
worry, fix the
disruptive
roof
That
in your
is the
front."
Wait,
exact
that raises a
mechanism
glaring
of
question, though.
shifting
The
global
roof of this
order.
rule
Wow.
is so
Or at
These
least
middle
members of
powers
climate
are realizing that they can no longer rely on a single superpower to keep the lanes open.
$1.5 billion.
Why
Exactly.
haven't
They are
they voted
actively
to destroy it?
de-risking their economy
That
against
is the
an
core
unpredictable
Welcome to the
American
deep dive.
foreign
United
policy
States
by
Senate.
Today
building
we're
their own
exploring
direct
a
The reason
classic
the
case
filibuster
of fiscal
survives
Okay,
is
let's
that
step back
permanently
and
destroying
summarize
it
the
requires
incredible
maneuvers
journey.
so
We're looking at the
extreme
strategic
and so
energy and
destructive to the
targeted,
institution
unprecedented
that it
strike
earned a
took out
terrifying
Iran.
nickname.
It's a huge
to
pot of
nuclear
money.
option.
Meant to
Exactly.
save the
The
massive
nuclear option.
theology
It's turning into a hidden tax, turning a
21-mile stretch of
paying an
water
electric
into the
bill
most
in
expensive,
Maryland.
heavily
It really
mined,
is.
launched
It's
this
become the
major
center of a
Okay, let's
huge
break down the
political
parliamentary
intrigue.
history.
You've got a
Perfectly
Democratic
stated.
governor
And that
changing
blockade
state environmental
immediately
rules
severed
of
the
very
global
awkward
supply chain,
compromises,
sending
and conservative
powerful
critics who
shockwaves
are
through the
rightly
race in
calling
our
this
highly
whole thing
polarized
shell
modern
game.
fertilizer
for your crops,
securing
when you
the
look at the
67
documents
votes
we have
change
today,
right at home.
reports, and because the U.S. proposals are deadlocked in an
Exactly.
So they found a
unresolvable
backdoor.
game of
Really
chicken
hard
and
to
backdoor.
Our
Middle
mission
powers
backdoor
like
that
Pakistan
bypasses
and
the
China
Follow the money.
always follow the money and act as
We
the
are
ones
going to
used
see
by
how a
Pakistan.
fund
designed to fight
and if we
climate
connect
change
this
is
massive
being used
geopolitical
to
the
holes
Senate
in the
Majority
budget
Budget
to
stands
you,
up
and we'll
and
dig into the
lists
argument that it
point
isn't
of
found
order
money at
they
all.
basically
Fragile
tell the
and
presiding
modern
officer
attacks
that
on
the
families.
written rule
Let's
means
get
something
right into it.
entirely
The
different.
price of the
strategic
food
energy
sitting in your
investment
fridge
so
will
the
cause
majority
the
leader
reaction your
basically
car is
stands up and
strictly
claims the
tethered
sky
to
is
these
green.
Essentially,
narrow,
on paper.
easily
Then the
disruptive
presiding
global
officer looks at the
screen
physical
Yeah,
rule
when
book
a
and
ship's
says,
navigation
"NII
screen
is
goes
managed
dark
by the
thousands of
Maryland
miles
Energy
away,
The text
your
says what
wallet
its whole
feels
stated
which is the
purpose
only
is to
logical
reduce
response.
energy
It
bills.
really
Pull
pulls
the
the
curtain
curtain
back
back
on
on
the
the
illusion
illusion
of
of
a
immediately
sustainable
appeals
solar
market
panels
chair.
and efficiency.
Everything is
Under
connected.
standard
Threads
Senate
are
procedure,
incredibly
is the
thin.
real
Deciding an
aha
appeal
and it leaves us
only
with an
requires
incredibly
a simple
important
majority of
51
actually.
vote.
So the majority party
Because they aren't fully resolved in
to
these
override the
intelligence
chair.
Okay.
And the
No, and that's
moment
why
they
politicians
hold
absolutely love
21
it. It
miles
feels free.
establish
of
a
water
So about
brand new
40%
weapon
comes from
to
regional
effectively
carbon
hold the
offsets.
entire
Overwrites
global
the
economy
But the big
official
chunk,
written
the one
law.
growing
And
like
if
crazy, that is
major
coming from
nations
something
are
called
now being
alternative.
forced
They
to cut
rewrite
their
the
own
rules
private side
using a
deals
simple
to keep the
majority,
lights
which is
on,
just a
ignoring
fancy
the
government
67
term for
vote
saying
requirement.
absolute end
It's a
of the
fire
nuclear
failure.
world.
It's
Let me
like
break it down. The dawn
sitting down to
era
play a
law
board game,
fragments
and
utility
right in the
companies
middle of a
buy
tight
a
match,
certain
your
amount of
team
green
decides to
energy.
rewrite
They
the
have to prove
instruction
they're using
manual
renewables.
just because
But
you
they
happen to
can't
have
find
one
that green
extra
energy,
player
or
at
if
the
it's just
table.
way
That's a
too
great way to